Hello and welcome to another week here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond, with your Thursday interview. Now, it's been an amazing week here at Viking.TV because we're celebrating the work of inspirational women the world over, following International Women's Day, which was on Tuesday. So my next guest, as you can imagine, is a remarkable woman who has dedicated much of her life to empowering other women. She's a passionate advocate for women's ability to help themselves, for rethinking the ways in which aid is delivered to developing countries. And during her career, she's led projects studying the best way to help after natural disasters, to longer-term strategies limiting the impacts of climate change and infrastructure development, such as access to clean water and sanitation for those in developing countries. Well, my guest today has seen it all for herself, travelling all over the world and applying her economist training to find the most cost-effective projects to address poverty, working in over 4 countries across Asia, Africa and South America. Some have described her as a secret weapon for charities like Oxfam and even the United Nations. So let's try and find out why and how she does it. Please meet Courtenay Cabot Venton. Hello, Courtenay. Hi.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, it's lovely, but we want to find out all about what you do, because I think most of us non-economists presume that your profession's all about sitting in an office in front of a laptop and working out numbers all the time. But your field work has been immense. What even led you into this sort of work?
It actually started when I was in high school. I was a passionate environmentalist and really wanted to find ways to protect the planet, and realized quite early on that the most effective way that I could convince corporations to implement measures to protect the environment was to put it in money terms, that was the bottom line and what was important to them. And being able to articulate that could make an enormous amount of change. So when I started at university, I majored in economics. I designed my own environmental economics degree. And as my career progressed, I realized I started to work more in developing countries and found that really when you start to talk about environmental issues in places where poverty is extreme, that the two are really intertwined. So a lot of my work then started to focus much more on the economics of poverty reduction, and specifically trying to help large government donors like USAID and the UK government to figure out how to invest more proactively in measures that would really have a significant impact on poverty.
It's a very interesting and probably, I suppose, a very new way of looking at it, because aid has traditionally always been, I don't know, I suppose a bit paternalistic. You know, what can we do to help you? Whereas what you are doing is arguing from an economics point of view, what is cost effective, therefore more likely, I suppose, to include or attract investors, and ultimately sort of works itself.
Exactly. And you've really hit the nail on the head. As you mentioned, I've worked in over 40 countries. I've worked on a huge range of types of interventions: education, water and sanitation, health, livelihoods, etc. So it's given me a very broad perspective of the different types of projects that people are working with. And as my career progressed, one of the things that increasingly became apparent was that empowerment, self-efficacy, a sense of being surrounded by your peers and having their support, is actually one of the most important drivers for poverty reduction. And yet it's just been fundamentally overlooked in a system that is indeed incredibly paternalistic and very much addresses poverty from the perspective of Western experts coming in, and often with a genuine perspective of wanting to help, but really not recognizing and leaning into the latent capacities and strength of local people.
I suppose it's a bit like, or it's an extension of that old phrase, if you give a man a fish, he has a meal. If you teach a man to fish, he can keep his whole family and he has meals forever.
Exactly.
A bit like that.
Yeah, and I think I would actually go a step further to say he probably already knows how to fish. There's probably, or she probably already knows how to fish. There's probably structural barriers that make life difficult. And climate change, to be honest, is one of the biggest ones. If you live in a climate where rivers are constantly drying up or rain isn't coming to feed your fields, it's very hard to make a living no matter how savvy you are.
I know that that's one of your passionate points, is that it's no good to be paternalistic. In fact, what you have found, the more people you've met, is that they know how to help themselves. They just need, I don't know, they need the empowerment that you like to talk about. Can you name or tell us about some projects that you have found to be probably the most cost effective, therefore the most attractive to people to actually get something done?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, one of the things that I started to recognize was that in principle, most every project is cost effective. If you invest in water or sanitation or education, there are numerous studies that show that the benefits that arise far outweigh the costs of investment. But I also recognized that while that held true on paper, when you evaluate those projects in the field, they actually, unless you've got the community buy-in to the project, they often fail. And there's this it goes back to that paternalistic system of, I'm going to come in with a great idea. I know you need water, so I'm going to put in a well. But if the local community doesn't have access to tools to fix the well or know how to fix the well, if they aren't bought into the project and leading on its design and development, the project won't succeed. And so this idea that engaging with local communities through a much more humble and showing a lot more humility in terms of really understanding that they need to lead is really critically important. That then ultimately played out. I was asked to go to Ethiopia, which is where that first picture came from, to help evaluate a women's self-help group program. These are groups of 15 to 20 women who gather each week. The approach is incredibly simple, but the results are transformative. They completely change their communities, and it's because they're working together to identify challenges and the mechanisms that they want to use to address those challenges. And so there's a very clear role to come alongside them, but to really always lean into them leading first. And part of why I was so enamored with the approach is because it really kind of embodied this idea that the human spirit, especially when we work together, is really strong and we can move mountains.
I know you're really passionate about this. Self-help groups, how do they work?
So it is a really simple model. It's groups of 15 to 20 women, as I said. It also includes men. It's often with anyone in a community who is marginalized and has a common challenge that they want to address. But we find that women heavily gravitate to the model. They meet each week. They do small savings. They coach each other on business skills. They give each other microloans. And all of that is really powerful in terms of economic empowerment. But the model goes so much deeper than that, because as these women start to collectively create change in their communities, they start to get a growing sense of how much more they can do, especially when they do it together. So I've been with groups in many countries, and they never cease to amaze me with the things that they're doing. In Ethiopia, one of the sort of really striking points for me was that the women decided to stop female genital mutilation, which, as many people know, is just a horrifying process and mostly undertaken by women. And all of these women's groups decided that they were going to advocate with all the women that they knew who were undertaking this procedure to stop. And they made huge strides in changing the culture. We also saw with COVID in India, women's groups banding together across the whole country, making sure that communities had community kitchens, access to masks and sanitizer and hand washing. This massive network of around 19,000 women just mobilized before any of the international community even was able to show up, to really make sure that their communities were taken care of. So the power of these groups is extraordinary.
I suppose a lot of people watching might say, well, if these women can do it themselves, why haven't they already done it? Until somebody such as you goes out and creates a business pattern or a business model for them?
It's such a great question. I think that part of it is that there are a lot of parts of this world where, for example, women can't even leave their homes unless they're accompanied by a male. So I've been working with an amazing British organization called Afghan Aid, who works with women's groups in Afghanistan. And one of the first things that they say is that mobilizing these women into groups requires someone locally to really push for it to happen, because they can't leave their compound without a male escorting them. So there is a need to provide these groups with funding and support around even just being able to form in the first place. What we find, though, is that if you see this approach in communities, and that usually involves hiring a local facilitator who can help to get these groups started and coach them in their first year of meeting, that they then go viral from there. So I've sat in schools in Ethiopia attending some of the women's meetings where there was a line all the way around the school. And I said, are those people coming to the meeting? Do we need to let them in? And they said, no, those are all the people in the village who want to be part of a group of their own and show up every week asking us to help them. So a lot of the women in the initial self-help groups will then facilitate, as a sort of pay it forward, will facilitate a new group. And from there, the approach really takes off, which is really exciting, because it means that it doesn't need external support indefinitely. It just needs support to get it going. Yeah. The one other thing I would quickly add to that is just that the women also will often ask for resources for things that are outside of their control. So for example, in Afghanistan, they've said, we would really love support to run human rights workshops so that we can start to re-engage with the mullahs and the leaders in our community around our rights as women. And sometimes you need some external support as well, either funding or through local organizations, to be able to bring in those kinds of capacities.
And I suppose the other thing that holds women back traditionally is the fact that they are bogged down with children to look after. But if you have a women's group, presumably they can help each other out with that.
So one of my favorite stories was with Senate in Ethiopia, who was in a women's group and quickly recognized that if all of these women were going to run these businesses that they were coming up with through their groups, that they would all need childcare. So she started a school. She ended up, I can't remember the exact numbers, but she had something like 400 applications every year for kids wanting to attend her school, because it grew so quickly and became known in the community as an incredible place for these kids to be looked after. So it's wonderful. Again, it's the power of collective action. We can address these problems if we all work together.
Now, I mean, I know it's International Women's Week, as it were, and we're talking particularly about women, but did you set out to target this as a woman's project, or did you just find that that's the way it started to develop?
No, I didn't set out at all. In fact, I didn't even set out knowing much about the approach. I had just been asked to evaluate this program in Ethiopia. And as I said, I've worked on so many different types of projects. So at the time, it was just another project where I thought, oh, this will be interesting to see how this works. I was blown away by what these women were doing. And one of the things that always sticks with me is I've sat under trees talking with local communities so many times, and they always rightly ask me after the meeting, we need help with this. Can you help us with that? I've got a sick relative. What do I do about this? With these women's groups, they couldn't stop telling me about everything that they were changing in their communities, that they were advocating with the local elder or the local government official to give them access to services, that they were cleaning up their communities. It was so exciting to see how on fire these women were. And that's something that has always stuck with me.
So you sort of discovered, or you probably already knew it, but you sort of discovered the power, the power that you can give women if you empower them. Sorry, that didn't make any sense. But the power of being a woman.
The power of being a woman, exactly. And to be honest, I think it's all with them. It's just, I think we can all identify with the fact that when we work collectively, we feel a lot braver to do things that we wouldn't do on our own. And so the women are already empowered, but it's just when they start to work together, it's kind of like a positive peer pressure. They start to activate and feel like they're much more able to go and do things that they might have been shy or hesitant to do before.
There's lots more to talk on that a bit later, because I wanted to get you to tell us about Hugh Jackman, the actor, and how he became very, very involved in this sort of thing too. And by telling his story, I think we can illustrate to everybody watching some of the things I know that you want to talk about. So Hugh Jackman, he's a Hollywood actor. What got him involved? In the end, he went out to Ethiopia himself, didn't he? And ultimately started his coffee company, Laughing Man Coffee.
Exactly right. So he went on a trip to Ethiopia with World Vision and was really inspired by how the farmers in this community, and ultimately the focus of his film is a man named Dukali and his family, how they were working within their communities to create change, and he wanted to find a way to support them. And as we all know, coffee is a very big export crop for a lot of countries, as it is in Ethiopia. They have fantastic coffee if you're ever in the field. And he wanted to, he also had a friend and colleague, David Steingard, in the US, who had a history in this business. So they set up Laughing Man Coffee, very much on similar to fair trade, very much wanting to support farmers in Ethiopia and in other countries through the profits that they made through Laughing Man.
And then later, you and he actually wrote some articles together, didn't you? And if in the articles you wrote, you actually do explain all about the self-help empowerment. If I can I just take you through a few of the things you said, because you said it earlier actually as well, but you said it in this article. Handouts, however well-intentioned, often fail. Why?
Because it kind of misses the point that it's not our job to come in as externals who feel like we've been educated, we have the great ideas, we know what should be done. And I do think that the paternalism around how we've seen the way that international aid works is really embedded within that. I think what Hugh and his team really understood was that by coming alongside and supporting and standing in solidarity with Dukali and his family, because we all have a role to play, they were able to open up access to a US market, to supply chains, etc. And then, very importantly, set up a business that could give its profits back to help with community projects. That's so much the better way to go. And I think we really need to kind of reframe the way that we think, whether it's in the US or the UK or anywhere in the world, that poverty is a set of external circumstances that put people in difficult situations. I think we've spent too much time feeling like we need to come in and solve them for them, and that doesn't work.
Yeah, you talk a lot about community mobilization and the fact that it does snowball, as you've said.
It does, indeed. And communities often have so many great ideas of the things that they want to do. And as I said, that's where we can come in and help, because some of those ideas require external resources or linkages to external networks. And that's where we can stand alongside.
As you say in the article, again, a hand up rather than a handout.
Exactly.
Yeah. Amazingly, as an economist as well, you were talking about the fact that it doesn't take a lot of investment to actually produce an enormous benefit. I think you talked about a self-help group in Ethiopia that was demonstrating community benefits over $100 for every $1 spent.
Exactly. And we actually got into The Economist with a graph that showed the self-help groups as the second most cost-effective intervention for Africa, which was definitely an exciting moment in my career. I think part of why self-help groups are so powerful is also because it's about communities identifying what they most need to change. So they don't focus on a particular sector like water or sanitation or health. They know what needs to happen and in what order in order to create change. And the upshot is that whereas with a water project, you go in and realize benefits associated with clean water, which is really important, with a self-help group, you see all sorts of benefits coming out around children's outcomes, education and health, around maternal health, around protection of children. The list goes on. And then, of course, there's all of the income generation that comes out of these groups as well from a very practical perspective. So part of why they yield such wide-ranging results is because it's all about them driving change wherever they see that it's going to be most effective for their communities. I would also just say too, I think one of the reasons why I was so drawn to these approaches, because of course, as an economist, I always have to underpin everything with evidence. And there are extraordinary studies, some of the most robust types of research that you can do that show that these women's groups have transformative impacts on all sorts of outcomes. My favorite is a study from Asia that showed that just being in a women's group reduced maternal mortality by 37%. We could not do that if we tried by throwing medicine or supplies or equipment. Obviously, again, those things are really important. But the fact that women encourage each other to get access to safe maternal care is such a critical part of the puzzle. And so that's a big part of why I've really engaged with these women's groups.
Yeah, and you've found as well that it just takes one mobilization, as you were talking about, to filter on down through healthy children, healthy maternity, healthy children with a prosperous community around it are more likely to go to school. And then there's something that you said about for every girl that goes to school, the risk of infant mortality is cut right down by even for her own children.
There are all sorts of studies that show the knock-on effects of these types of interventions are extraordinary. And it really flips the paradigm so that the community is leading on these initiatives, which also means that it's far more sustainable because now the power is in their hands to lead the direction of their communities. Part of the problem with coming in as external agencies is that often we come in with a well-funded project for 3 years, and as soon as we leave, the project stops functioning because there isn't that sustainability, the ownership by the community. So there's also a real element to this that means that these impacts are realized over the long term.
And actually, to go back to Dukali, the coffee farmer that Hugh Jackman met, it had a knock-on effect even within his own family, didn't it? Because his wife then thought, I could set up a business, and did.
Exactly. It impacted not only his whole family, but his whole community. It really transformed the way that they thought about what else could we be doing, because they had had some support to start their initial ideas.
Incredible. Tell me about the Share Trust. I think you set that up in 2018. What exactly does it do?
So I set up the Share Trust because as I was walking alongside these women's groups, I found that there was very little recognition of the extraordinary impact that they were having. I also found that there was not really a community of practice for bringing together all of the different organizations that work with women's groups, support them in their initial formation, and then help them to grow and thrive. And I really wanted to be able to build the evidence base and convince more of the people that I work with, the government donors, foundations, etc., that this was potentially one of the most transformative ways that we could strategically be addressing poverty reduction. So I bit the bullet and I set up the Share Trust as an organization to really support women's groups across the globe and the organizations that support them so that we could start to build more of a community of practice around this work.
All over the world?
All over the world.
Where are your favorite projects?
Oh my gosh. That's a hard one to say. To be honest, I miss going to Ethiopia. It's one of my favorite countries to travel in, but it's been a lot harder in the last few years with the conflict that's been there. I do love all sorts of travel, and it's been hard with COVID not to be able to go. Right now we have projects in Uganda, so I'm actually going next week, my first trip post-COVID, which will be really nice, and also in Nigeria and Bangladesh. So the world's an amazing place. I don't think I could pick.
So the women you meet in all of these various different countries, Are they the same? How different are they? What sort of women are they, or are they absolutely any?
They're absolutely any, and I've seen groups that are with specific age groups. I've also talked to teens who really want to be in groups with older women to be able to learn from them. They like having their grandmothers in the group with them. Um, it varies substantially. I'd say that usually what's most different is the types of barriers that they are facing to be able to realize change in their community. So, for example, I gave the example of Afghanistan, where already many of the women were very sort of cut off from everyday life. And so they faced their own very specific set of challenges. And obviously, with everything that happened in August, that's even more of an issue now, which is why it was so exciting to see them asking for human rights curriculum. In India, we've also experienced groups that are very cut off, not allowed to leave their home unless they're fully covered and with men. And one of my favorite studies has shown that those same women, when they're in a self-help group, are 2 times more likely to engage in local politics, to really raise their voice and speak out for the issues that they care about. So I think the differences really lie with how the different women are dealing with different challenges in their communities.
I can imagine that there are some cultures which may be very suspicious of, women rising up and doing things for themselves. I mean, that was going to be my question, very simplistic, of course, but what do their men think of their...
It's a great question. So typically in the first year, when the approach is seeded, it's really interesting. Quite a few organizations have told me that they will host effectively a town hall and say to people, this is the model. Does anyone want to come and be a part of a group? And typically half of the people will leave and half of the people will stay. The ones who stay will then form their groups. And they also pretty consistently say that the first year is pretty tough. The men aren't thrilled, and even other women in the community are slightly suspicious of what they're up to. But everybody says that after about a year of meeting, that's when you start to see the lines outside that proverbial school building wrapping around. And you also see the men really starting to engage and supporting the women in their groups. So you do see this sort of mental shift and transformation that's really quite remarkable. We've actually seen women's groups work on issues like gender-based violence, where they combine the women's self-help group, where the women feel safe and where they can address the issues that they have to think about, with meetings with the husbands and the self-help group members, so that they can start to address the root causes of gender-based violence and find ways to make a way through it and not let that be a part of their family life. So there are some pretty powerful ways that self-help groups change the gender dynamic.
It very much is, isn't it? That, as you said earlier, it's planting the seed and seeing what happens. And sometimes growth will be at different rates, but hopefully it will always be there. There's a picture of a lady that you often pin to your computer when you're working, because her whole story matters to you and tells a story. Can you tell us about Meseret, is it?
Meseret, you have it exactly right. That's one of the reasons why I wish I could get back to Ethiopia sooner rather than later. I would love to see her and see how she is. So Meseret was one of my first exposures to women's self-help groups. She was one of the first in this particular cohort in a city that's about 3 hours north of Addis, the capital. And I went on my field visit when I was evaluating the self-help group model in Ethiopia that got me started on this work. And she was one of the people that I interviewed. I will never forget, it was raining and we were sat in this really old classroom with a tin roof. So the rain was sort of pounding on the tin as she was telling us her story. And you could have heard, well, except for the rain, you could have heard a pin drop because her story was so powerful. She grew up in a relatively poor area, but her family was reasonably well off. Her dad had a good job. She had several siblings. They were all in school, and she had pretty big dreams for her future. When she was a teenager, her father died unexpectedly from a medical condition. And it left her family in a really tough spot because now they really didn't have a family income to lean on. She started small businesses on the side while she was still trying to go to school so that she could support her family. But being one of the oldest children, it was very tough to kind of keep her studies going. And then she was married to a man that was abusive towards her. And she told me, and this is in that article, about before things got really bad between them, when she had her first child and was trying to nurse her child, the two of them had moved to the city, the three of them, so that he could find work. And they didn't have any money for food. They just had a mattress on a floor in a room. And he would bring home half of the meal that he was given at his work so that she would have enough nutrition to be able to nurse their baby. So they really hit hard times. She then joined a self-help group, and in Ethiopia, they often talk, coffee is actually incredibly central to their culture. And they often talk about how they will, if they don't have money, they will bring 2 coffee beans a week as their contribution to the savings. And she would say, how am I going to change my life with 2 coffee beans a week? Which is something you hear from lots of self-help group members. But what they found was that when 20 people brought 2 coffee beans a week, and then when they decided to give up a cup of coffee a day to see if they could enhance their earnings, and then when they used that to invest in something, that actually the money multiplied very rapidly. And so we've seen these groups do extraordinary things. And she actually ended up becoming a representative for their local governments, representing women's rights. As she was able to grow through her self-help group. She also credited them, which you hear time and again, with being the most incredible support as she navigated her way through the situation with her husband. He left, he went to another place for work. And when he came back, she had bought a house and furnished it and was raising their children because her self-help group supported her through it. So you can't underestimate how little you can start from and how far you can get.
But culturally, that must have been very difficult for her with him, because suddenly she was successful. She bought her own house. He'd come back to I mean, he can't have taken that very well, can he?
Well, she actually, one of the wonderful things about the story is that she actually reconciled with him. They managed to have conversations and figure out a way through. And she said, if this ever happens again, I will leave you. And I haven't seen her for a few years, but they were able to reconcile their relationship into something far healthier than when he left. So again, it really speaks to the power. And I think that would have been hard if she hadn't had the support of all of these women around her who were able to really, she also would describe, I think it was her mom had died of cancer, and how all of her self-help group came to her house and just sat with her. Again, it's so simple, but it is what gets us through life and is incredibly powerful.
I guess we also need to remind ourselves it's not just about her and the other women. It's about the way they are then bringing up their children, boy children included, to accept things slightly different. If you've been brought up by a strong mother who owns her own house and has her own business, you're going to think very differently when it comes to your own marriage and your own relationships, aren't you, when you grow up?
Exactly. And actually, if you look at the psychology, as an economist, I never thought I'd be reviewing psychology literature, but I've been reading seminal studies from the 1960s. There's a strong psychology behind how your network of peers fundamentally shapes what you think you can do and how you can do it. And having these positive peer role models where you're problem solving together, which then filtrates down. And actually, her daughter was part of a self-help group as a youth as they started, and their parents supported them to be in their own self-help group because they were in school, so couldn't do the money saving part yet. So you do see it ricochet down the generations.
Yeah, drip down economics, is it? I don't know.
Exactly.
But when you are talking to various people, I mean, I said at the beginning that you talk to the United Nations, you talk to big charities. Where does the funding come from? Is it from them direct to help fund these sort of projects?
Unfortunately not. Our system is still very much geared to go through Western, large, international nonprofits, and they have a lot of value to add, but there's a really big movement at the moment to try to reframe what is effectively a colonial paternalistic system to be able to support these groups directly, either the community-based organizations that support them, or even I've done some work with trying to channel funds directly to the women's groups themselves. And that's something that we've really been trying to build evidence around and to start to shift, is the importance of funding local organizations that are really connected to their communities, that are listening to these women's groups and understanding their needs, and then really channeling support directly to them so that they can realize their goals. Part of why that's hard to do is because we all come in with a mental mindset of, I really care about children, or I really care about education. And all of that is incredibly important. The problem is, as soon as you do that, you're saying, I'll give you money if you do things to do with children, or if you do things to do with education. And the power of leaning into these women to kind of say, actually, the thing that we're most concerned about is violence or is livelihoods, and really support them on their journey with what they see as their primary needs, is so much more honoring of their lived experience, but also so much more effective in terms of allowing those dollars to go further.
Yes, but it's as you said from the very beginning, they know what they want. They just haven't got it yet. And the empowerment is enabling them to seek it and find it, I suppose, and get started. We were talking about drip down economics, the way it can affect just about everything, growing out of a family into a village, going down through the generations. I know you're the mum of 3 children, I think, yourself, aren't you?
I am.
What do they think of what you do, and what do you tell them?
So this is a slightly older picture, but one of my favorites. My daughter is now 16, a junior in high school, and my 2 boys, Sam is 14 and Charlie is 12. My daughter's name is Esme. I love watching them grow into this world and find the things that they are passionate about. They are such an inspiration to me. And so Esme is actually going to come with me to Uganda this summer to help design a youth program to support the women in the Kampala slums. And it's really fun to see her kind of take that on and want to do something more. And then the 2 boys, Charlie actually is a huge fan of David Attenborough and set up a whole campaign at school. They ended up filming him because he wanted to protect the natural world. So he's a passionate environmentalist. And Sam adores mountain biking. And it sounds so simple, but he just wants to teach other kids how to mountain bike and how to build their confidence. And so part of my joy having teenagers is getting to see them each find their own thing that they're passionate about.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing again, isn't it? They know what they want. It's just about enabling, I suppose. Where are you in that photograph? You look as though you're out somewhere up a mountain.
We're in Yosemite. It was a great trip.
Yeah. Always wanted to go there.
You must.
So, again, there'll be people watching now who absolutely get what you're talking about and would love to get involved or help or do their own bit. But so many people think it's too big a problem. I can't go to Africa and do whatever. Excuse me, my alarm's going off. I can't go and do this. I'm just a so-and-so. In what way can ordinary people like us do something to help you do what you do, or to get involved, or just to be part of a project?
So I think that there's 2 aspects to that. Obviously, funding for all of us who work in this world is a lifeline to be able to do our work, and is amazing. I think thinking about where you send your philanthropic dollars, no matter how small or how large, but really trying to reframe the way that we think about how we support people. And as I said, that applies whether it's in your backyard or whether it's halfway around the world. really leaning into the incredible power and social capacities of local people and finding ways that you can come alongside is so important. And I think that plays out not only in how you choose to give and actually spending the extra time to find some of the local organizations that might be closer to the communities that they serve, but also how can you, just like the self-help group members, how can you use your time to go and engage in community initiatives and really be part of movements that are creating change? We have one very practical initiative that we just started. We began a giving circle to support these women's groups in Afghanistan a couple of weeks ago. And we've been really excited by the energy around it. So that would be one very quick and easy way to lean in and support these women directly as they start to figure out what their future likes in a country that's really been hit hard. That campaign we can send, we can attach a link to that as an initial, as an initial idea. And with that, what we're trying to do is to ask people to actually just stand in solidarity with these women and support them as they decide what they need for their communities, and then give people a chance to learn about how these women are changing their communities over time.
I must say, and I think everybody watching at the moment will think, you know, you think about these big projects or big problems in the world, that women aren't getting the empowerment that they need, that they are made to stay at home and only can go out with, you know, with a male member of the family, or they are pinned down by their children and unable to flower. And you could get very low about it. But you're optimistic. Everything you've said is hugely optimistic.
I have my days when when I feel a little more downtrodden by what happens in this world. Certainly my work gives me a lot of exposure to things that I wish I didn't ever have to see or hear or know, and that's difficult. I think, though, you know, even just reflecting on Ukraine right now and seeing the power of people who care about what happens and the ability of the world to come together, I think that's what I see reflected every time I spend time with one of these women's groups. As I said at the start, you know, they can't stop telling me about how they're going to change the world. And I think between them and my children, who have boundless energy for the things that they care about, I try to really lean in and draw my energy and strength from them, because I think they still have incredible optimism for how we can make this world a better place.
Are there any particular women who have inspired you all the way along the line?
There are quite a few. I grew up with a very feminist mother who taught me a lot about being vocal about what it means to be a woman and hold your place in this world. I also grew up with an incredible network of aunts and cousins who have incredible careers in their own right, each of them. And I love, to be honest, I draw most of the inspiration, I know this sounds so cliche, but from the next generation, because watching my cousins who are in their 20s blaze trails in their chosen careers is so inspiring, and just feels very different to the world that I was born into, where a lot of those rights were still being fought for. So I draw a lot of energy from them.
Yeah, there is a lot of progress going on. I mean, there are some bad things happening too, as you just said, but I've got, I was going to say young children. They're not, they're old children now, but they are optimistic and they are determined, and they, like you said, have boundless energy. And isn't that a wonderful thing?
Indeed.
Yeah, do you think, though, and this is a controversial question, which we won't tell the men, I even ask, do you think there is something particularly extraordinary and wonderful about women as opposed to men?
Oh gosh, that's a tough question to answer. I think I'm going to answer it slightly differently to your question. I think what I am really hopeful for is a world where we all lean into each other's strengths, I have a husband who is extraordinarily supportive of my career and really acts as a model to our kids of what it means to be a fully hands-on dad. And I couldn't ask for anything more with that. And I love all the narrative, even though we have a long way to go around really getting away from the stereotypes. I feel like when I look at my two boys, they haven't been given a great framework to grow up into in terms of what the social and cultural norms are around who they're supposed to be and how they should act. And so I think really for me, my wish and my hope, and we see lots of signs of it, although as you say, there's still a lot to do, is that we're kind of honoring of a much more equal playing field for how all of us engage with the world, moving away from some of the stereotypes around who we are supposed to be.
But do you think at the moment we still do need a sort of International Women's Day? We've still got a lot of way to go, so maybe we do still need to laud women.
100%. The things that happen to women around the world, the inequality is still so huge, and we've got to see that playing field leveled. And I think also, that's very much what I'm wanting to see in my work as well, is more of a leveling between countries around the world and our perceptions of poor versus wealthy, and who has the resources and who has the knowledge, and really reimagining how we think about who has the power and who can be drivers of change. And I think if we can lean into groups that have historically been marginalized, women, LGBTQ, poor people who are consistently told that they can't do as much as everybody else, that we will see a much better world for it.
Yeah, there is no can't, as they say. I think Yoda said it or something, didn't he? if I told the 16-year-old you that you would be doing what you're doing today, going all over the world and empowering women and bringing about real change, would you have believed it, or was it what you always dreamed of?
I think at that point in my life, I would have assumed that I was probably on the front of a Greenpeace boat trying to stop somebody from polluting something. I was fully into my environmental activist self at that stage in my life. And, as I mentioned, once you start talking about environmental issues in developing countries, the conversation is much more intertwined with all of the different drivers of poverty, which ultimately drive environmental damage. So I think I would be thrilled to know where I've ended up, but I don't think I would have expected it. And I just want to clarify one thing, which is really important to me, which is that I actually don't see myself as empowering other women. I really see myself as standing in solidarity with women who face way more than I have ever had to face, and acknowledging their power and kind of saying, you've got this, and I know that when you work together that you will create extraordinary change, and I will be here to help if you need me, is kind of more how I see it. I love to move away from the idea that again, we are kind of doing something for them, and rather just acknowledging the incredible power that sits with these women already.
Maybe it's not empowering, maybe it's finding or enabling them to find their own power, or whatever. Anyway,
yeah.
Where did you say you're off to very soon?
Uganda.
Uganda. Wow.
Next week.
Is it your first project there, or do you know Uganda well?
I know it pretty well, actually. I've been there a few times, but obviously I haven't been there for a while with COVID. So I'm just trying to find the parts of my brain that remember how to travel so that I can get there with everything that I need. I'm going to spend time. We have an incredible coalition of 14 local organizations that we've been working with specifically in Kampala. They have been designing and implementing a program that we've been helping to fund to really address the needs largely of women and girls, but also men and boys in Kampala. One of the things that they found this summer, they did a rapid needs assessment because Kampala had a second lockdown in July this summer. And they were deeply concerned about teenage pregnancy, which went up very significantly in the first lockdown. And as you can imagine, when a young woman becomes pregnant, it really cuts off all other opportunities for the rest of her life. So we wanted to understand whether that was happening and how the coalition could respond. And they found, very disappointingly, I had assumed that a lot of the teenage pregnancy would be related to being stuck at home with abusers. It actually turned out that nobody had any food because all of their jobs had been cut with the lockdown. And so children, both boys and girls, were going door to door to engage in transactional sex so that they could help their family to be able to eat. And so this coalition has been doing incredible work. All of the organizations are locally founded and led by Ugandans, and they have been trying to help address some of the sexual and reproductive health needs, as well as get kids back in school, help disabled kids. So I'm going to be going to meet with them for the first time since we started working with them. So it'll be very exciting.
Yes, I can imagine that in many parts of the world, both so-called civilized and not so, the pandemic and all its needs, like lockdowns, for instance, have almost maybe halted some of the empowerment that was going on, the growth, and so there's still a lot of work to do on that, isn't there? Recovery.
It's not only halted, but in many cases reversed it. It really has had a huge impact on people's ability to maintain work, particularly, especially because so many people are based in cities now, and because they go looking for work, but they're often engaged in the gig economy, which of course was the first thing to lose business in the pandemic. So it's been very tough on a lot of countries.
You've got a lot more work to do then, I suppose, haven't you?
We do.
You get on with it. It's been brilliant to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Talk about inspirational. I wanted somebody inspirational to interview this week, and oh my goodness, you have fitted the bill. It's been wonderful to meet you. Very inspirational, and I hope it will get a lot more people involved as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne. I so appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and goodbye too. And next week, let me just tell you what we're doing next week. We're going to be cruising down the Seine, visiting Paris and the heart of Normandy. And of course, as you'll well know, Notre Dame. We're going to look at Notre Dame because I'm going to be talking to the senior environment editor of National Geographic magazine. He's called Robert Kunzig, and he's written a special edition all about the restoration and rebuilding of Notre Dame after that terrible fire there, which was in April 2019. Stunned the world. He was in Paris when it happened. We all wondered how they could possibly rebuild it, but a massive project to do just that is underway, and Robert's going to bring us some incredible pictures from inside Notre Dame as they do try and rebuild it. He's lived in Paris, and like anyone who's ever visited, he feels very attached to Notre Dame. So we'll hear his story next week. Until then, do stay well and goodbye.